Good evening, all of you. And I want to thank Joyce for those words, and especially Dean Sterling and the YDS community for this invitation to come and to share about the research that we're involved in. Also, the folks who made this lecture possible, I want to pull that in a few slides. But in a sense, this is not a cumulative conversation that I'm going to have with you tonight. It's more almost a report from the field. We're only about a third of the way through this 5-year project, and so these are what we're gleaning thus far in this project. But when I have conversations with clergy and other religious leaders, it's very interesting to watch them go from feeling like they're the only person who's suffering to realizing that they're just a part of this very large thing, and it somehow gives them hope that they're not alone and that there's a possibility to move on. So I want to talk some about our research tonight, and then also leave you with some of what I think might be some perils or some challenges yet to come, but then also some possibilities that we see in the data. So this lecture series, the Ensign Lecture, right, celebrates the many years at Southport that Reverend Ensign was at, and the lecture is to focus on contemporary interpretations of religious issues. Well, I don't know many religious issues these days that are more serious than what the pandemic has introduced to religious life and especially to congregational life. And you may have noticed on the previous page, I use endemic there. Just to give you an idea of how serious it is, I chose that word in part because if we had said pandemic, a bunch of people who listen to that go, well, the pandemic's over, or the pandemic didn't exist, you know. And if I say post-pandemic, then a whole nother group of people say, what do you mean post-pandemic? And so endemic, in some sense, captures this idea of it's sort of with us and it's going to be with us a long time. Whether the virus is with us or the challenge from the illness is with us, it is beside the point in some sense, because the last 2 years have changed congregational life and congregational practices, but they've also changed human beings. We're not the same people as we were before, and congregations aren't the same. So in fact, this pandemic is an endemic for congregations, congregational life, and I think we're going to be living with that reality, whether the virus or not, for quite some time. I'm very glad that this project is 5 years, and I was with some of the funders this last couple days and hinted to them, I think we need another 5 years because I want money. No, I want to fund our research projects. But also because I think it's like long COVID, right? I mean, we're going to be seeing the effects of this for quite some time. But let me get started. So to show you just how significant it is, you all know that congregations in New England don't ever change, right? Those ruts are really deep. But yet, take a look at what Southport had at various times on their website, right? This church closed for 2 years. However, programs and worship continued virtually. That is probably the first time they ever said something like that in their existence, right? Not only that, they turned the balcony into a mass section, an unmasked section. I mean, these things are major changes to the life of a congregation, especially a congregation in New England that doesn't ever change. Not only that, look at the many different ways that you now can give money to the church, right? I mean, we're talking options for giving, texting and Venmo and online through the website, even snail mail. Oh, and of course, I forgot, the donation plate, right? I mean, if you think about what congregational practices were like back in 2019 and what they experienced over the last 2.5 years, this is not quite the same reality that it was before. And how we wrap our heads around that and what the long-term effects of that are is essentially what we're trying to capture with this research project. So as I said, it's a 5-year project of Christian congregations around the country and was funded generously by the Lilly Endowment. But it really is a kind of multifaceted, mixed method research project where we are surveying pastors, we're doing key informant surveys about congregations, but we're also doing about 100 case studies of congregations around the country. We're creating a panel of, we hope, 300 churches to follow those same 300 across the whole time of the research project. And then we're also doing, we hope, upwards to 100,000 surveys of attenders who go to various churches to try to get different dimensions. But then we're also collaborating with all sorts of other projects who are studying specifically the online and virtual aspects, the technological ones, and other ways to try to capture as much of what's happening as we can. It remains to be seen what we're going to find in the coming 5 or so years, but that's what we're trying to track them across time to see what some of these long-term effects are. Our 3 primary questions in the project are somewhat, what did congregations do in response to the pandemic, right? I mean, but that's a past question in some sense, and it's already been captured a good bit by other people. What we're more interested in trying to do across this 5 years is take snapshots of what does it look like now? What does it look like now? What does it look like now? And every time we do that, we find it's not the same picture, right? Things got to a point, and they keep changing every time we survey them. So we want to capture that for at least 5 years. But then the overarching question is not so much what is it, but really what are the long-term effects and consequences of this? How will have congregational practices and practices of attendees and such changed over time? Secondarily, we're looking at the leadership roles in this change. We're also looking at what effect it's had on congregations of color in particular. And then obviously the technological changes of congregational life and what are the implications of some of that. Before I go into some of the findings that we're uncovering, I do want to set the stage in some sense by taking a look at our 20-year-long Faith Communities Today project, because it's been mapping how congregations have changed over the past 2 decades. And right as we started 2020, we were engaged in the latest decadal study of congregations. And so we had already put out our survey. About 2/3 of the respondents had already responded by the time the middle of March came around. And so we're still out in the field. We quickly got the survey and made a few changes and said, think about this as if the pandemic never happened, give us pre-pandemic information. But essentially what we collected was over 15,000 responses from congregations right there at the beginning of the pandemic. So we have this wonderful baseline, in some sense, of what things looked like immediately prior to the pandemic. And so we use that kind of as a baseline, but that also tells us that those 20 years of data tell us a lot about what was the situation that congregations found themselves in as they were going into the pandemic. I have talked, and many other people have, I think, said the same thing. In some ways, the pandemic hasn't introduced new dynamics into the life of religious communities, but it certainly has amplified all of the challenges and all of the trends and the trajectories that were already there. And so what are some of those? And so I want to just highlight a few of those for you before we go into the data itself. Probably the most striking to me, honestly, I've studied megachurches for 30 years, so I think about size every day. But this is a really dramatic thing. When we looked at congregations in our first Faith Communities Today survey in 2000, the median worship attendance was 137. And the median is, right, half the people were below it, half the congregations were above it, so the kind of midpoint. 137, that would fill this room pretty tightly, right? In 2020, prior to the pandemic, the median was 65. That's half as many in just 20 years. And if you only look at the mainline congregations in the sample, the median is 50. And now, with 50, you have a hard time even funding a full-time clergy person, let alone also programs and other kinds of things. And yet we know, and I'll show you in a second, that the demand for services and programs and things rose incredibly during the pandemic. For a congregation, on average, was about 50 people. That's a real interesting challenge. Also with size, and this isn't always in people's minds because it's hard to see. But in fact, if you look at where are all the people, you find this incredible mismatch. We have millions of we have tens of thousands of small congregations, which doesn't really amount to as very many people. About 10% of all the congregations in the United States have almost 70% of all the people who go to church. So, think of the disparities of income. You have the same dynamic here. Now, you can see, I usually have my students go, okay, so what is 10%? What is the top 10%? Well, you see, it's 250 and up, which almost no one, at least outside of New England, thinks of 250 as very large at all. And yet, that's the marker for the top 10. So if there's about 350,000 congregations in the country, we're talking 35,000 congregations have almost 3/4 of the people. That means there's so many other small congregations that are really small or struggling or just don't have the resources. And we'll see how size plays out during some of the pandemic challenges. It's good to keep these things in mind. But I don't want to imply that there aren't strengths at all sizes. Because, in fact, if you look, I have it broken down even more discretely by size. There are qualities across all the different sizes of congregations. The ones that report that they have a high spiritual vitality or that they have high thought-provoking worship services or living out the faith. And it's really not that much different across sizes. So there is a swath of vital congregations, no matter what the size. But we'll also see that with size also comes resources. And with those resources, there are many ways to capitalize on some aspects of the pandemic. Another thing that we have noticed over those 20 years is that there's an increasing and presence of multiracial congregations in the country. So again, in 2000, when we started, it was about 12% that the congregation had at least 20% that were not of the dominant racial group. And that's doubled also in 20 years to almost a quarter now. And if you look at those congregations and you look at immigrant communities and congregations of color, over and against congregations that are predominantly white, nearly completely white, you notice that there is a vitality and a sense of more vitality in a sense in those congregations that are multiracial or of non-white majority. Interesting to think about. But I do want to, with that sort of background, I want to go into some of the findings from our study. And this just sort of summarizes what we've done thus far. We had the 2020 Faith Communities Today research, but then we've done 3 national studies of congregations in the summer of last year, in the winter of last year, and then in the spring of this year. And then we're engaged in putting together the longitudinal panel. We have about 70 or so case studies completed by now. And we are planning for our next large study, which will happen in March of 2023. So all of this is underway, and there are many, many more to go. But as you can see, if you take into account virtual attendance and in-person attendance, essentially the median has stayed the same, even if our perceptions of that by how many people are sitting around us has changed. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that's the perception that we get from the data for sure. So a quick glimpse from the data from our summer and fall survey, both before the Omicron variant. At that time, most congregations had said they had people who tested positive. I would venture to say every congregation now has. About a third to 40% had ministry staff testing positive. 28% had someone in the congregation die of COVID, but only 2% had a staff person die. Almost 2/3 of clergy encouraged their people to get the vaccine, and we'll look at some differences there. But only 8% served as some sort of testing or vaccination site. And when you dig deeper in that 8%, almost half of that was African American congregations. So significantly overrepresented in opening up their congregation as testing or vaccination sites. A lot of the headlines that we've seen over the last couple of years talked about conflict in communities and congregations, about whether to be masked or to get vaccines or close or not close. But in fact, I was a little surprised that we found what I would have thought was relative low levels of conflict. 52% said they had mild conflict, and almost a third said they didn't have any. Nevertheless, 2/3 did have some, but it surprised me. I expected sort of 100%. Not only that, what we're seeing is relatively few congregations that are now only in person worshiping or only online. The vast majority of congregations are still, at this point, as of March, doing some sort of hybrid worship where they're both in person and live streaming or some other way. It remains to be seen how long that lasts. And when we look at what kind of hybridity is going on, In some cases, there's 95% of the people are in person and a few people watch. And then in some other cases, and we just did a blog post recently on this, there were several small congregations that said, we're thriving online, and they just did away with meeting in person. And so now these small congregations that were like 15 or 20 are now 40 or 50 online, and that's how they're going to stay. They're not going to ever go back to meeting in person. So there's a wide array of how this is being handled. It remains it's something that we're going to watch very carefully because it depends what the balance is between the two and what the kind of dynamics are there. So during the pandemic, not surprising at all, there was an increased demand for the services of congregations, right? There was more food assistance requests, more financial requests, more counseling requests. That's not too surprising. Actually, maybe I would have thought the increase was a little bit higher even, but nevertheless, there was an increase. And congregations really stepped up to this. I assume most of you are connected to some congregation. I mean, it was really quite amazing what congregations did. Almost 55% of congregations said they either amplified what they were doing to meet the need or also started new programs at the same time. So the need is great, and congregations responded in kind. That's really promising, right? However, there's also this other challenge. And this was probably one of the most shocking things to me when we got the first data set back and started looking at it. Because normally, when we ask in the faith communities today, we ask clergy, what % of your membership is regular participating in terms of volunteering? It usually is around 40%. In 2020, it came out to be 44%. And that first survey that we did in the summer of 21, it was 15%. Now, some of that's explained, right? If you're not meeting in person, you don't really need ushers. If you're not having Sunday school, you don't really need Sunday school teachers. Those kinds of things make sense. But we thought that would bounce back as more people were meeting in person. It didn't at all in the winter. It was still 15%. And by March, it had gone up, but only to 20%. So still half as many volunteers. Now, it doesn't take a social scientist to know that congregations run on volunteers. I mean, the staff couldn't possibly do everything. And so what you have is this real challenge, greater need, greater efforts to meet that need, and yet fewer people. And that also means some congregations were cutting hours, right? Some congregations were letting go of people. But the people that remain, the volunteers that are there, the clergy that are there, are essentially working double and triple time, not only doing all the stuff they always did before, but now they're also figuring out how do we live stream things, how do I get licenses for the music, all these other things that they never had to worry about, they now had to do, and they have to do it with fewer volunteers and fewer. So even if the pandemic wasn't a burden for people, just having half as many people is putting these undue pressures on the remaining volunteers. And we see this in the economy too, right? All of the help wanted signs, and the people who are working there are working twice as hard because they don't have enough folks to take care of everything. So it's a real challenge, and the challenge is also real for congregations. But not so much financially. Yeah. What we saw in the pandemic surveys thus far was giving actually went up. And some of this probably had to do with PPP loans, but not by the end of 21. Those were long gone by that point. And so what was normally the median was 120,000. It went up to 140,000 to 150,000. But we've seen that come back down now, so that our last survey showed that the median income was back to where it was pre-pandemic. And some new data just came out recent, 2 days ago, I believe it was, from an organization, Lifeway, and said that many congregations now are realizing that they're suffering some financially, whereas before there was. However, our data also showed that it's a mixed bag, because in case of some congregations, giving increased, but for other congregations, giving really decreased. And I'll talk about this a little more later. This pandemic affected all of us, but it didn't affect all of us equally, nor did we respond equally to the pandemic. And I want to talk about that. But 30% agreed that their financial viability was at risk. And almost 20% said that their church's continued existence was at risk. If continued existence at risk means near closing, we're talking almost 70,000 congregations. That's a significant concern. But when you start to look at those, it's pretty clear that it wasn't the pandemic that caused this situation, right? They were already in kind of dire straits. There was already conflict. They were already in a state of decline. They were already having trouble making ends meet and being viable. And so the pandemic just amplified a lot of that. Another headline that we have seen, I assume, if you've looked at anything on religion in the pandemic, is that nearly 40% of clergy are leaving the ministry, right? They're thinking about defecting. And exactly that's what we found. If we asked, have you seriously considered leaving the ministry? 37% said yes. So if that was the headline, 37% seriously considered leaving the ministry, then I would get lots of clicks, right, on that story. But if you look a little closer, you see, how often do you think about seriously leaving the ministry, right? After the congregation got upset with the sermon that you did, I thought that. Or as I like to say, the fight I just had with my wife, you know, I think things about her that I wouldn't think every day. But if you look at people who said fairly often or very often, it's not 37%, it's 8%. Or very often, you know, I worry about those folks, that's only 3%. And on any given year, there's data that says that maybe 1.5% leave the ministry on any given year. So in the midst of what a lot of folks said was the hardest year ever, almost 70% said this was the hardest ministry year ever, it only bumped up those who really thought about leaving from 1.5% to 3%. So this is not a tidal wave of people leaving, but they are struggling. They don't have enough volunteers. They're probably working twice as hard, doing hybrid, not just, you know, in person. So there's a whole host of problems going on. So it's not surprising that they would say this was the hardest year ever. And frankly, I would think more thought about leaving the ministry. But it's not the awful picture that sometimes the headlines have painted. It's also clear as we continue to play with some of this data and start doing interviews with some of the clergy and looking at the dynamics of the congregations that different people perceived this differently, and different congregations had different encounters with this reality. In almost every question we ask, there's roughly 50% that agree, 50% that disagree. It doesn't matter what we ask, whether the ministry had major disruptions or financial viability, or we struggled to maintain contact with our people. Half said yeah, and half said no. So it's pretty clear. Even those congregations, and I've had some conversations with some of them. I said I study very large churches. There are some that have made their claim to fame of late by denying that any of this stuff existed, and yet almost all of those folks are also suffering decline, challenges. Even if you deny the reality is still there, right? And so, but perception is a part of that, and so it's clear. Religious education, one of our surveys in March focused totally on religious education and Sunday school and vacation Bible schools and how what's it like now, what was it like during the pandemic. For some, it continued without any real major disruptions. And for others, it basically collapsed. And the easiest way to make it collapse was to keep religious education for children and youth online. If you kept it online, you probably don't have a religious education program now. That's not true, though, for adults. Adults seem to love religious education online, and we're hearing stories about all kinds of Bible studies, all kinds of prayer meetings, all kinds of education events that are happening online for adults, but not for children and youth. And so, different perceptions of this. Also, some congregations never closed, and we kind of forget that, or we blame the evangelicals because those are the headlines. But in fact, Catholic and Orthodox congregations were much more likely to not close. They may have stopped briefly, but came right back. And one of our colleagues is a researcher in Orthodox congregations, and he's been looking at this closely. And the Orthodox congregations that stayed open actually have grown immensely, because at the time, all the other Orthodox churches that had closed, all those folks wanted to be in worship and went to that other church. And so you see this real disparity of some that grew. But you also see that mainline Protestant, even among mainline Protestant, there was still about 6% that didn't close. And when you look at those, it's predominantly the very small congregations, rural areas, that kind of thing. They also, congregations, held different ideas about vaccination. Again, not surprising, because that's part of the headlines that we get. But half the evangelical churches encouraged their people to get vaccinated. About half didn't. The same is true with Catholic and Orthodox congregations. It was considerably higher in mainline congregations, right? Almost 80%. But that also means that 22%, kind of were on the fence there. Probably mostly Methodist, because Methodist is a pretty diverse mainline denomination. But all of these different ideas mean at least that the congregations thought very differently about the experience of the last 2 years. Whether that's going to make a difference in the implications over time, well, it remains to be seen yet. But it's something that we're going to watch. Those congregations that perceived this as threatening were mostly in the mainline Protestant, but not entirely. And also, one of the things that we've been playing around with a little bit is a scale that I've created that looks at the questions we ask that seem to indicate a congregation or a pastor that filled out the congregation, the survey, had an optimism about the pandemic. Like, we're going to come out of this better. We're going to find new ways of doing ministry. We have a positive outlook on this crisis, and that varies pretty significantly also by, in this case, denominational family. Well, I'll come back to that a little bit because I think that's really key, not so much in how we perceived the pandemic, but how we responded to the pandemic. And I think that's a really important distinction there. But there's also another significant variable in all of this. Not surprisingly, since I started with size, I think size is also another important variable to think about how our congregations being affected by the pandemic. You can see here that the smaller the congregation, the more likely it is to have budgetary woes. It's also the case that the smaller the congregation, the more likely it is that the pandemic was a significant disruption in their religious education programs. In the most case, in a congregation relatively small, there were probably only 1 or 2, maybe 3 people in the Christian education program, and so doing this, they probably didn't go online, and things suffered oftentimes. It's also true that size has a pretty profound effect on the capacity for continuing to do outreach and to, when we ask the question of, do you have resources to pursue the new opportunities as a result of the pandemic? It's absolutely clear that the larger the congregation, the more likely they are to say, yeah, we have those resources. So it's not so much that they're suffering any different, but they can activate their people and activate resources if they have them, and they're more likely to have them if they're over 200 or over even 100. They also, the larger the congregation, the more positive the outlook. Not too surprising, they have resources, they have, but you notice that it's not as dramatic as some of those other size dynamics. But I do want to end the data portion of this with, I think this optimistic outlook does make a big difference, right? If someone gets, and we've all probably experienced this, someone gets a diagnosis of cancer of some, and the first response a person has is often one of the other. I'm going to die, or I'm going to beat this, right? And I'm not sure if it's because somebody's optimistic or because somebody's pessimistic, but there is this quality in some people to look on. I hate to say it, look on the bright side, because then I start humming it to myself, and so now it's stuck in my head. I was giving this talk fairly recently, and I showed this slide, and I started hearing somebody whistling. It's like, no, don't do that. But, so the question is, which comes first? The congregation is kind of flourishing here, and then because of that, they're optimistic, or they have this optimistic outlook, and that leads to flourishing. We don't know, right? That's one of the challenges. But this idea of entering difficulty with hope, right? Or just knowing that we're going to beat this is a really interesting dynamic. And so we put together these questions. Our congregation is willing to change to meet new challenges and will emerge from the pandemic stronger and is thinking of new ways about our future mission, or has identified and embraced new opportunities because of this. if you scored high on those, okay, so it was the senior leader usually filling out the survey, so that person may be optimistic for the whole congregation, but those questions correlate really strongly together as a scale. And then when you start to look at what correlates with that scale, you see that you certainly, well, I'll say, you see all these dynamics that mesh with that. So it's not just this pie in the sky, rosy colored glasses optimism, but it does actually coordinate to increased growth, other kinds of flourishing signals. And so from the clergy perspective of this, the person usually filling out the survey, this really strongly, I mean, in scores that you almost never see with correlation, correspond to the clergy's assessment of their own sense of purpose and well-being and mental health and physical health and life satisfaction. Those are off the scale. So it's not just the congregational perspective that we're going to come out of this, but it's also the leader's perspective that I'm feeling good about my mental health, about my ministry. But it's not that these folks didn't also suffer, right? Because the highly optimistic clergy scored even a little bit higher on 2020 being the hardest year of ministry. But they were the least likely to consider giving up because of it, no matter whether they were in small churches or big churches or any of that sort of thing. And it's negatively related to them doubting God and considering leaving their church or their ministry. Interestingly, African-American pastors and younger clergy were more optimistic than other clergy. And when we did some interviews, even still kind of in the midst of the pandemic, my colleague here, Allison Norton, did these interviews, and you could tell I mean, we also have a Thriving in Ministry project, that, as Joyce said, and not all of those folks in the cohort of this Thriving in Ministry project had these statements. Some of them said, "Oh, we're going to die," right? But this, I feel like the church, as the church, we have won the pandemic. I mean, that was in the midst of the pandemic still, and yet some of these folks really had this very optimistic, we can beat this. And in fact, we've watched some of them, because some of them are in our next cohort of thriving pastors, and their congregations are doing incredible stuff now. So there is something going on there, at least from the clergy perspective, but also from the congregational perspective. If you look at things like, did they have growth, or were they striving for diversity, or were they describing themselves as spiritually vital and alive, the higher you scored on that optimism scale, the more likely you were to be growing, to have a high spiritual vitality and such. So there's something playing out there. Maybe the clergy were feeling good about themselves and therefore feeling good about the church, but those churches were also growing more and more vibrant and vital. So there is something happening there that we want to continue to watch and we want to look at further. Now, the title was Perils and Possibilities, and so I wanted to put down some challenges that I think are facing congregations and religious leaders at this point, at least based on the data we have so far. I think the questions of attendance and volunteering and giving concerns that are looming in there, especially the volunteering one, is really a question of commitment. And how do you take a group of people who had low commitment for almost 2 years, and then ramp that commitment back up to where it needs to be, where it used to be. And so it's almost like the challenge is, how do we revive the people that we had, but then also, build from further? Not only that, the virtual participation is not going to go away, right? It's not going to go away in adult religious education or in committee meetings. And who's going to turn off their live stream? Even though in Christianity Today, there was an article just last week that said, we need to turn that off because it's ruining our churches, as opposed to, wow, let's make it better so it builds our churches, right? But no, I'm working on an article like that. What are you talking about, turn it off? Because we have people who are homebound, and we have people who have special needs, and this adds to the congregation. What we need to do is stop thinking about virtual worship and instead think about, how do we do virtual church? So how do we enhance, which is my engagement membership sort of question, how do we enhance the virtual component to make it equal the in-person component? That is going to take a lot of creativity, but it can be done. There's a way to get those people connected with each other for fellowship and get them to do ministry and get them to volunteer. It just is going to be different than it is in person. But that's the only way that virtual participation is going to actually work. Not only that, we have changing facility needs, right? If half the people are coming now, there's a lot of space that could be used for other things. And so how do we get creative about alternative uses of this space? I've already talked a little bit. This new ministry patterns are still evolving. Hybridity is there, but also there are all sorts. As I told you, these small, older congregations are like giving up face-to-face worship and doing something different. Oh, that's fascinating. And I encourage clergy all the time to, at this moment in time, throw all the spaghetti on the wall you can, because we don't yet know what's going to work. But so we try everything and see which ones of those things are actually resonant. And we're also at a point where there's a continual need for change and alteration and innovation, with fewer people already exhausted after 2 years. So that's only going to continue, and every clergy person I talk to is exhausted. And yet everyone also has to face the reality that they have to keep innovating and they have to keep trying new and different things, because if they don't, it's going to diminish their ministry. And then we also have to deal with all of the things that we had to deal with prior to the pandemic, like the nuns, like the decline in attendance, like even our core people only coming once a month rather than every week. I think about my poor grandmother would turn over in her grave because she got a 20-year perfect attendance pin. Now, I can't even imagine. Even the pastor doesn't do 20 years perfect attendance, right? An enormous amount has changed. And all of that was before the pandemic that we have to deal with too. So on top of that, there's all this other dynamic. But I don't want to leave you with this hopelessness, right, or these challenges. There's also, I think, some real possibilities here. No congregation can go back to the line, this is the way we've always done it, right? Because for the last 2 years, they didn't do it that way. And so, I grew up on a farm. You never would just go out and scatter seed on the fields. You always had to prepare the fields. You had to till them, you had to break it up, and then you planted the seed. But when you till a field, if you've ever even grown a garden, the first thing that comes up is not your seeds you planted, but all the weed seeds that are already in there. And so we have this dilemma, right? our gardens, our congregations have been seriously tilled over the last 2 years. And that is a fertile place to grow new ideas, but it also brings up a lot of things that were under the surface, we're settled, we're not going to talk about those things, and now we're talking about those things. Oh, we love the organ. Oh, screw the organ. Oh, we love the pews. Never mind, we're going to rip out the pews, right? I mean, there's all kinds of that happening these days. It's good. Unsettledness is a good moment because it allows us to settle things in a different way, in a new way. And so then we have to ask ourselves, right, is like the reinvent rather than replicate, right? Is this really what we want? We didn't like it before. Why go back to it again? The Israelites. Oh, we want to go back to Egypt. No, you didn't like Egypt, right? This gives us a time to build closer to the promised land, right? With new models, with different dynamics, more possibilities, and also the pandemic has brought a new clientele, new people, even if some of the new people were previously excluded people, like our elderly who were homebound, or people who worked on the weekends, or people with special needs, right? Those folks are there now. So we have to think about what is our new congregation, right? And that's a great possibility in many ways. I think the pandemic has also brought home to us that we can't do it alone, that no congregation really is adequate, and that it takes sometimes many congregations together to address the issues of a community and a neighborhood. And whether that's working with other social services or other congregations or governments, there's, I think, a new opportunity for us to connect with others and create these networks and partners. And then finally, I really think that this kind of idea of optimism and the positive stories are what's happening. And I was just at a meeting where there were all sorts of positive stories raised up about people taking ministry in a new direction over the last year or so. I think that makes a huge difference because it pulls some of those people who are less optimistic into a mindset that says, well, maybe there are ways that we can do something about this, right? Like that one quote previously, okay, so we have new technology, but you could say new technology, oh, we have more work to do, but you could also say, well, this new technology, this is how we're going to worship in the future. Let's think of new ways of using this, right? So the more you hear of new ways, maybe the more likely you are to be pulled into that high optimism component. So that's where we're at this moment. We have our next survey coming out in March, April of next year, and we're collecting all these case studies to really understand sort of some of this dynamic. And it just keeps going on and on until 2026. So stay tuned. Here is our website, covidreligionresearch.org. But any of our websites, Faith Communities Today or the Hartford Institute, all will get you to the same place. But thank you very much.
Identify just who you are and if you're an alum or just a student, the faculty, quickly, and then state your question. If you've got a comment, disguise it as a question. Okay, back here in the back.
Number one, thank you very much. I'm Talitha Arnold, class of 1980. I serve the United Church of Santa Fe in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I can't disguise it. I just want to say thank you for your study. We're part of the 300 that you've been interviewing.
Oh,
And the
excellent.
fact,
Woo!
I mean, and the fact that you're doing this has in fact helped our congregation and me personally to realize we're not in this alone, and that there are others that are, to see some of the trends as a way of, I think, engaging and empowering both clergy and congregations not to give up and to learn from one another.
Wow,
I don't know what the question would be. How do I thank you more? That's my question.
We'll pay you. How's that? Thank you. Thank you.
Plug too. So Talitha is coming back this spring as our Hoskins visitor. She's got a remarkable ministry in the church she serves, environmental ministry, and she will spend 2 to 3 days here with our students to help them think about how when they serve churches, they can have a very vibrant environmental ministry. So I just want to put that plug in now.
And you too can be a congregation in the study. On our website, you can volunteer your congregation, and in some cases, we pay you.
Thank you, Talitha. Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. I'm from a Baptist church in North Carolina. Thank you for the research, and I'm fascinated by the time period when you were asking these questions, and curious because right in the midst of that, the United States saw the largest mass protest movement in history in terms of number of participants. And I'm curious if you had questions or responses from churches that engaged how they responded to that.
We didn't in these surveys. Essentially, the way we have the survey process set out, the first survey we did, we tried to get a wide swath of responses to the pandemic itself. And then each of the other surveys as we go along, we're using some of those questions, but then we're delving deeper in different topics. And we do intend to delve pretty deep into the racial question, but it's also a significant piece of what we're doing in the case study congregations because, right, a survey is a pretty primitive tool to capture some nuanced thinking and such. And so we have pretty extensive questions that we're asking clergy and we're asking congregants around some of those questions in the case studies. But we will also have one of our surveys that we're asking throughout the years focus on that as well. So thanks.
Joy Bussert from Minnesota, Lutheran class of 77. Thank you. I have been following your institute on many different issues for a long time, so how nice to meet you.
Yeah, thank you.
What it feels like to me, in my context right now, is that the churches have emerged from the pandemic. It's like a chrysalis sitting there sort of stunned by the sunlight. And I was at a clergy conference, theological conference, a couple of weeks ago where there was so much creativity in the room. It's like a moment. And I picked up on what you were saying around on three things: climate change, racial justice, and economic inequality, and how can the churches sort of harness this energy right now. Okay. And I'm wondering if the optimism piece that you talked about so well is related to that sense that we've survived, we've made it, and now, how do you harness all this creativity all at once around major movement questions that hit us during the pandemic? That's my question to you.
Yeah, no, I think that is the question to be asked. I thought about it, and I not a chrysalis, I'll have to ponder that image too, but I've thought about it and talked with my staff about it. We're all coming up out of the storm shelter, right? The last 2 years was the hurricane or the tornadoes, right? And now we've just come up out of the basement to see the devastation, right? The world isn't the same as it was before. And so around the hurricanes, you saw, and the flooding in Florida and elsewhere, you saw some people saying, oh, we're going to rebuild and it's going to be better. And then you saw other people saying, well, we have to change because of the climate, we have to, act. And then you heard some people say, oh, I'm just leaving here. I'm going to go somewhere else, right? So you saw all those responses, but we're at that moment where there's this devastation, and how are we going to rebuild? That's why I think there are possibilities at this moment, which is kind of what pulled me toward what's making the 35% of the congregations look like they're flourishing and 50% of the congregation. I mean, some of it is size, some of it are these other things, but there are other dynamics going on, and we'll see. We're going to keep playing with that, and we've injected some of that into the interviews and things that we're doing too.
Last question.
Emily Ash, and I'm from South Florida, Southeast Florida, Palm Beach County, and with the Presbyterian Church USA. When COVID broke on the 17th, our presbytery, 40 some odd churches, the pastors and some elders, we started talking out at 10 o'clock or 3 o'clock every Tuesday. And we have not stopped that.
Oh, that's
We
excellent.
talk every Tuesday all through this time, continuing just the other day. And so we have been able to create and change and pivot and all those things. But I just want to thank you for your work, because I sent this to my presbyter, and also we're going to add this to our conversation, so thank you.
Sure. We also try to do webinars and talk on every time we have a new report out and such, but also I can make this whole slide deck available to the school and to the website and such.